The London season of 1812 was in full bloom. Carriages rattled through cobblestone streets, ballrooms glittered under chandeliers, and young débutantes floated in white gowns like fragile porcelain dolls. But amidst the whirling elegance and whispered courtships, Lady Amara Ellington stood apart. At 40 years of age, she had become a silent legend in society. The spinster who never married, once admired for her striking intellect and rare beauty, she was now a subject of mockery for the young and a convenient cautionary tale for the old. "She's still attending balls?" A powdered matron whispered behind her fan. "They say she turned down 3 suitors in her youth." Another replied, "And now look at her, alone." Amara heard them. She always did, but she had long since mastered the art of turning cruelty into background noise. Dressed in deep indigo silk, with her tightly coiled black hair elegantly pinned, and adorned with pearls, she carried herself with quiet command. She was not the blushing girl of the season. She was a woman who knew the weight of rooms, the sting of stairs, and the strength of standing alone. The ballroom of Lady Winthrop's spring gala buzzed with anticipation that evening. It wasn't just the music or the flowers, it was the arrival of the Duke of Ravensworth. Alexander Trevelyan, Duke of Ravensworth, was a man whose very presence turned heads. At 38, he was wealthy beyond measure, powerful in Parliament, and utterly uninterested in marriage. His cold gaze and precise manner had earned him a reputation as the unattainable Duke. Women fluttered around him like moths to a flame. He gave none of them more than a calculated nod. When he entered the ballroom, conversations softened into murmurs. His tailored black coat emphasized his tall frame, and his sharp features carried an aloofness that bordered on intimidating. Yet his arrival was not what unsettled Amara. It was his gaze. Across the ballroom, through a sea of lace and gossip, his eyes found hers steady, unflinching, curious. It wasn't the predatory glance of a man selecting his next conquest. It was the look of a man seeing something unexpected. Amara's heart, long accustomed to indifference, gave a betraying thud. Lady Ellington drawled a familiar voice at her side. Lord Pembroke, a family friend turned petty tormentor, leaned close with a smirk. "I do believe His Grace is looking at you." "Then he must be bored," she replied coolly, taking a sip of champagne. Pembroke chuckled. "At your age, my dear, even boredom would be a miracle. Don't give yourself hope." Her grip on the glass tightened, but her smile didn't falter. "I stopped giving myself hope when I realized some men find cruelty more comforting than wit." Before Pembroke could respond, a hush spread through the room. The Duke of Ravensworth was crossing the ballroom toward her. Alexander approached with the deliberate steps of a man who never rushed. Conversations parted like water around a prow. He bowed, precise and formal. "Lady Ellington," he said, his voice low and clear. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced." Her brow arched slightly. "We have not, and yet you seem to know who I am." His lips curved faintly. London society does not often forget the unusual. She met his gaze without flinching. Unusual is a word men use when they cannot categorize a woman. For a heartbeat, he seemed intrigued. "May I have this dance?" Whispers exploded around them like sparks. The Duke? With her? She hesitated, not out of nerves, but calculation. Accepting his hand meant stepping into the center of every judging eye. Refusing might look like bitterness. So she did what she always did. She owned the moment. "You may," she said. As they waltzed beneath the chandelier, Amara felt the weight of every whisper, every skeptical stare. But Alexander's hand was steady, his lead precise. He didn't make idle chatter or flattery. Instead, he studied her with unnerving focus. "You don't fear them," he said quietly. "I've lived too long to fear children playing court," she replied. "Then, what do you fear?" he asked. The question was unexpected. Her steps faltered for half a beat before recovering. "Irrelevance," she said finally. "Not being seen for who I am." His expression shifted, not pity, not amusement, something closer to recognition. When the dance ended, he didn't offer a perfunctory bow and leave. He escorted her to the edge of the ballroom, eyes lingering for a moment longer than society deemed proper. Behind them, the gossip churned like a storm. "She's 40. She's beneath him. He's just being polite." But Amara knew polite men. Alexander Trevelyan was not polite. He was deliberate. As she left the ballroom later that night, the image of his steady gaze burned itself into her thoughts. For the first time in years she felt something stir beneath the armor she'd built, a dangerous, quiet spark. And miles away in his carriage, the Duke stared into the dark London streets, his gloved fingers tapping against the seat. He had spent his entire life dismissing society's women. So why did one defiant spinster's eyes follow him into the night? The days following Lady Winthrop's spring gala rippled through London's social circles like a stone thrown into still water. The Duke danced with Lady Ellington. Perhaps it was pity, perhaps desperation, or maybe curiosity. Amara ignored the whispers as she always did, though she felt their edges more keenly now. It wasn't the gossip that unsettled her, it was him. In 40 years of life, Amara Ellington had learned to read men with the ease of a seasoned scholar. Their glances, their ambitions, their weaknesses. But Alexander Trevelyan, Duke of Ravensworth, was different. His attention wasn't fleeting or hungry. It was measured as if he were studying a rare artifact he hadn't yet decided whether to claim or admire from afar. One crisp morning, as spring sunlight streamed through the windows of her modest London townhouse, a commotion stirred downstairs. Her butler, Harris, appeared at the parlor door looking both pale and excited. "Your ladyship," he stammered. "His Grace, the Duke of Ravensworth, has arrived, unannounced." Amara looked up from her writing desk, quill poised mid-sentence. "Now, yes, my lady. He is, in the front hall." She exhaled slowly, setting the quill aside. "Very well, send him in." Alexander entered as if the house belonged to him, his tailored dark coat perfectly pressed, boots shining, gloves tucked neatly in one hand. He bowed slightly. "Your Grace," she greeted evenly, rising to meet him. "I was not expecting visitors this morning. Certainly not. You, forgive the intrusion," he said, his voice smooth but edged with purpose. "I dislike delays. And yet, society thrives on them," she replied, arching a brow. He didn't smile, but his gaze sharpened. "I've given the matter some thought," he began, pacing slowly across the room, "and I believe our recent encounter was not insignificant." Amara folded her hands. "A single dance, Your Grace. Society often mistakes choreography for destiny. This is not society," he said quietly. "This is strategy." He turned to face her fully. "I intend to marry before the end of the season." She blinked. "You intend to marry?" he repeated. "My position demands it. Parliament has become increasingly vocal about my duty to the dukedom. I need a duchess who will not falter beneath scrutiny. One with a spine, intellect, and an ability to survive the wolves." Her breath caught. "This cannot be happening." "Why?" she asked slowly. "Are you telling this to me?" "Because," he said, stepping closer, "you are the only woman in London who neither simpered nor schemed in my presence. You were not intimidated, nor did you fawn. And that is precisely why I require you." For the first time in years, Amara laughed, not softly, but in genuine disbelief. "So this is your proposal? A list of my political advantages?" He tilted his head. "Would you prefer empty poetry? I could lie, if it makes you more comfortable." She shook her head slowly, a smile playing at her lips despite herself. "You're remarkable, Your Grace." Not charming, but remarkable. He approached the window, looking out at the street below. "We are not children, Lady Ellington. I do not offer love, nor do I expect it. What I offer is security, position, and respect. As Duchess, you will have authority few women in this city can claim. You will not be ornamental. I would not marry you for that." Her pulse quickened, not from romantic flutter but from the sheer audacity of it all. 40 years old. Mocked. Unmarried. Imbecile. And now, the most desired man in London was asking for her hand, not out of charity, but because he saw her worth in a way no one else had. "And if I refuse?" she asked carefully. He turned back to her, eyes like tempered steel. "I don't think you will." She met his gaze steadily. "You are bold, Duke, and you," he said softly, "are far too intelligent to pretend you don't recognize what I'm offering." That night, long after he left, Amara sat by the fire with a single candle burning low. She thought of her youth, of proposals turned down in hopes of something grander, She thought of years spent being the woman everyone dismissed the moment she crossed 30. This proposal wasn't romantic, but it was real. By morning, her decision was made. 2 weeks later, beneath the vaulted ceilings of St. George's Church, Amara Ellington became the Duchess of Ravensworth. The ceremony was quiet, but scandalous in its implications. Society was stunned. She's 40. He could have chosen anyone. Why her? But Alexander didn't care. He stood beside her with the composure of a man sealing a contract he intended to uphold with precision. She in turn held her head high, not like a woman swept away by romance, but like a queen stepping into power. As their carriage rattled away through London streets, the weight of the vow settled between them like fine silk and iron. She stared out at the city she had lived in for decades. He sat beside her, composed and unreadable. Two people, past their youth, bound by strategy, not love. And yet, beneath that quiet arrangement, something unexpected had begun to smolder. The carriage wheels crunched over the gravel drive as Amara Trevelyan, newly titled Duchess of Ravensworth, gazed out at the vast silhouette of Ravensworth Manor for the first time. It was not a house, it was a fortress. Gray stones stretched skyward, ivy climbed like veins along the walls, and the towers stood proud against the moody spring sky. The air was crisp, with the faint scent of rain and roses not yet bloomed. Beside her, Alexander, Duke of Ravensworth, sat straight-backed, his gloved hands resting neatly on his cane. He looked out of the opposite window, his face unreadable. Not once had he spoken since they left the church. Not once had he reached for her hand. The newlywed carriage might as well have carried two strangers. As they approached the grand entrance, the massive oak doors opened to reveal a line of servants. The butler, footmen, housekeepers and maids all arranged like soldiers awaiting inspection. The butler intoned, "Your Graces," with impeccable precision. Alexander stepped out first and extended his hand to her, not with tenderness, but as one might offer assistance to a guest of rank. She placed her hand lightly in his, descended the steps with the grace of someone who had faced society's cruelties for decades, and met the eyes of every servant in the line. Some were curious, others skeptical, a few openly surprised. A woman of 40 stepping into the Duchess's role was not the debutante bride they had expected. Alexander spoke curtly to the staff. "The Duchess will take residence in the East Wing. You will treat her commands as you would mine. That is all." And with that, he strode toward his study without looking back. Mrs. Claiborne, the housekeeper, stepped forward with a respectful curtsy. "Your Grace, if you'll follow me, I'll show you to your apartments." The East Wing was grand but colder than she imagined. The windows let in gray light, and the rooms, though furnished with elegance, lacked warmth. Heavy drapes muted the air. Portraits of past duchesses lined the corridors like silent judges. Her chambers were large. A dressing room, a private salon, and a grand bedroom with a carved four-poster bed. Everything was immaculate. Everything was distant. Amara ran her hand along the windowsill, feeling a faint chill. "When was this last opened?" she asked Martha, her loyal maid. "Judging by the dust, Your Grace," Martha whispered, "years." Amara looked out at the gardens below. Ravensworth was beautiful, but it did not welcome it tested. That evening, she dressed in deep plum silk for their first dinner as Duke and Duchess. She descended the staircase with calm dignity, even as whispers floated faintly from the servants stationed in the shadows. The dining hall was vast, designed for 20 guests. Tonight, only 2 places were set, one at each end of the table. A literal gulf stretched between them. Alexander was already seated. He rose when she entered, nodded with polite formality, and gestured for her to sit. They dined in silence as servants moved efficiently between them, placing dish after dish. The only sound was the clink of silverware and the faint crackle of the fire. After several long minutes, Amara spoke. "Is this how you always dine, Your Grace? As if you're attending a funeral?" His eyes lifted to hers, steady but cool. "I dine in peace. Conversation is rarely worth the indigestion it brings." She tilted her head, her tone calm but sharp. "How fortunate, then, that you've married a woman with nothing to say." A flicker, not quite a smile, but close tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You misunderstand. You have plenty to say. That's precisely why you were chosen." "Chosen," she repeated, setting down her fork. "How romantic." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence was his armor, just as her composure was hers. Over the next few days, life at Ravensworth fell into a rhythm of formal distance. He rose early to attend to estate matters and parliamentary correspondence. She explored the house quietly, learning its hidden corners. The conservatory lay abandoned, vines crawling over glass panes. The library was magnificent but untouched, and the west wing where his private study and chambers were remained a world apart. Servants observed her carefully. Some warmed to her gentle authority. Others whispered that the marriage was odd, the powerful Duke and the 40-year-old Duchess, who seemed more like a business partner than a bride. But Amara did not wither. She had spent decades surviving London's coldest rooms. She could survive this house too. One afternoon, as rain pattered against the windows, she stood in the long gallery staring at portraits of previous duchesses. Each face was young, pale, demure, perfect wives for powerful men. "Do you find them intimidating?" a voice asked behind her. She turned. Alexander stood in the doorway, his presence commanding even in silence. "No," she said. "Predictable." He raised an eyebrow. "And you are not?" She met his gaze evenly. "I never was." For a brief, fleeting moment, something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but acknowledgement. Then, just as quickly, he inclined his head and left. That night, as she sat by the fire in her private salon, Amara realized something vital. This house was not just his fortress, it was his prison. Every hallway, every cold portrait, every ritual of silence was a wall he had built long before she arrived. She sipped her wine slowly, eyes narrowing at the flames. "Very well, Your Grace," she thought. "You built this fortress, but I have lived outside the walls my entire life, and I am not afraid of the cold." The rain had settled into a quiet drizzle by morning, leaving the gardens of Ravensworth Manor soaked in silver light. Servants hurried to air out the manor's many rooms, and Amara wandered through the halls like someone exploring an ancient cathedral, respectful but unafraid. She had been Duchess for 3 weeks now. The gossip in London was still buzzing, but she had grown accustomed to being watched. What intrigued her far more was not society's stares, but Alexander's silence. He moved through the house like a commander through a well-ordered camp, precise, deliberate, unreachable. But even the strongest fortress had weak points. She intended to find his. That afternoon, Amara ventured into the conservatory, a place the servants claimed had been abandoned since the late Duchess's passing. She pushed the creaking door open, and a wave of humid air, tinged with earth and rot, greeted her. Glass panes were streaked with dust. Vines had overrun the iron benches. But beneath the wildness, there was life, stubborn, green shoots sprouting through cracks in the floor. She removed her gloves, rolled up her sleeves, and began clearing away the dead vines with methodical determination. She had no intention of being a decorative figure in Alexander's house. If he would not speak to her, the house itself would. It was there that he found her hours later. "Your Grace," his voice echoed through the glass room, low and firm. "This is not work meant for you." She straightened slowly, brushing dirt from her hands. "And yet, here I am, doing it." Alexander stood framed in the doorway, dressed in dark riding clothes, damp from the drizzle. He looked out of place in the wild green tangle. Too structured, too clean. "This room has been closed for a reason," he said. "Because it belonged to her," Amara replied softly. His gaze sharpened, though his voice did not rise. "Yes. And now it belongs to me," she said simply, lifting a pair of pruning shears like a challenge. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Rain tapped lightly against the glass overhead. Then something shifted in his eyes. Not anger, not approval. Something unsteady. He turned without another word and left her to the vines. But that night at dinner, for the first time, he asked her, "Did you manage to tame the jungle?" The question was dry, almost teasing. Amara smirked over her wine, a little at a time. "Good things take patience." He inclined his head. "You surprise me, Duchess." "And you," she replied, "are easier to rattle than you think." For the briefest moment he laughed, quietly, like a man who had forgotten how days passed. The conservatory transformed beneath her care, vines trimmed, sunlight restored, roses beginning to bloom again. Servants whispered that the Duchess had brought life back to a room long associated with mourning. And slowly, imperceptibly, Alexander began to appear, sometimes in the library, where she would find him reading but watching her over the top of the page. Sometimes on the terrace, where their conversations shifted from polite necessity to something sharper, more alive. He listened when she spoke of literature, argued with her over politics, and challenged her wit with the same precision he brought to parliamentary debate. For a woman who had spent years being dismissed by younger men, it was intoxicating to be met. The turning point came one stormy evening. A sudden windstorm swept through the estate, rattling the old windows. One of the maids ran to inform Amara that the north gallery shutters were jammed, and the rain was pouring in. Without hesitation, Amara gathered her skirts and hurried through the dim halls. She found the gallery half flooded, the wind howling through a broken latch. She climbed onto the ledge to force the shutter closed, her indigo skirts whipping around her legs. Her hands strained against the swollen wood. She didn't hear him arrive until his voice cut through the wind. "Amara." She turned, startled. Alexander strode toward her, rain dripping from his shoulders, his usual composure shattered by urgency. He grabbed the window, bracing against the gale, and together they slammed it shut with a final heave. For a moment, they stood inches apart, breathless, wet, hands still pressed against the wood. "What in God's name were you thinking?" he snapped, but his voice trembled at the edges. "I was thinking the house would flood if someone didn't act," she replied evenly. "You could have fallen, but I didn't." The fire in her eyes met the fear in his real, unguarded fear, and in that charged silence, something cracked open between them. His voice softened. "You are infuriating." Her lips curved. "And you, your Grace, are not nearly as heartless as you pretend." He stared at her then, truly stared, not as a duke observing a duchess, nor as a man judging a woman's suitability, but as a man seeing a woman, fully, perhaps for the first time in years. He stepped back abruptly, clearing his throat. "You should change out of those wet clothes before you catch a chill." But his eyes lingered just a moment too long. That night, alone in her chambers, Amara sat before the fire, replaying that stormy moment. For years, she had been told she was too old, too opinionated, too late for love. But in that gallery, in that wild wind, the most powerful man in London had looked at her as if she were undeniable. And miles away in his private study, Alexander stared at the brandy in his hand, unsettled by the memory of her eyes in the storm. The fortress he had built was no longer unbreakable. It had cracked, and she had been the one to find the fault line. The turning of spring to summer brought with it more than blooming roses at Ravensworth. It brought the eyes of London. Alexander's sudden marriage to Lady Amara Ellington, the unmarried spinster of 40, had stirred gossip for weeks. But when the season reached its political peak, whispers turned into knives. The first blow arrived one morning in the form of a sealed letter, delivered by an ashen-faced footman. Alexander broke the wax seal with his usual precision, but his hands froze halfway through reading. His valet, observing from the corner, saw the Duke's jaw tighten, a rare sign of agitation. "Your Grace, the house has been made aware of troubling allegations regarding your Duchess's late father. Questions have arisen about his dealings abroad, specifically his opposition to colonial expansion. Certain members are preparing to raise this in Parliament. We urge you to act swiftly to protect the reputation of the Ravensworth name." Alexander folded the letter slowly, as though the paper itself had personally offended him. Amara was in the conservatory when he found her. Her hands were covered in soil, tending to the first blooming roses she'd nurtured back to life. She looked up as he entered, immediately sensing the storm behind his composed expression. "Something's happened," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "They're coming for you," he replied bluntly. She tilted her head. "How original." He handed her the letter. She read it slowly, lips tightening into a thin line, not in shock, but in recognition. She had lived her entire adult life with society's quiet cruelty. But this was something deeper, political, calculated. "They're using my father," she murmured. "They tried to ruin him when he was alive. They'll do the same to me now." "Explain," Alexander demanded, not unkindly, but like a man gathering ammunition for battle. She met his gaze steadily. "My father opposed Parliament's exploitation of African colonies. He spoke against it publicly. Powerful men despised him for it. They called him a traitor to England, when in truth, he was a traitor only to their greed." His expression darkened, the full weight of what this meant settling in. They intend to humiliate you to weaken me. A duchess whose father was labeled a traitor. It's exactly the kind of scandal Parliament feeds on. And what do you intend to do? She asked. For once, he hesitated. Alexander Trevelyan, who commanded rooms with a glance, looked conflicted. The gala next week. Every political viper in London will be there. If I distance myself, her voice cut in, sharp. If you distance yourself, they win. They have wanted my silence my entire life. I will not give it to them now. Their eyes locked. She wasn't pleading. She was challenging him. The night of the summer gala arrived like a storm wrapped in silk. Carriages lined the grand entrance of Lord Pembroke's estate, glittering under lanterns. Inside, the ballroom was a theater of judgment, powdered wigs, jeweled gowns, and gossip behind every fan. Amara entered on Alexander's arm, dressed in deep emerald velvet, her head held higher than ever. Her presence was a statement. She didn't flinch under the stares she met them, one by one. Lord Pembroke himself approached, all oily charm. Your Grace, he said to Alexander. And Duchess, a pleasure, as always. I do hope the recent conversations in Parliament haven't unsettled you. Not in the slightest, Amara replied before Alexander could speak. Men have been discussing my family for decades. Almost flattered it takes all of Parliament to try to match my father's courage. A few gasps. A few chuckles. A few sharp intakes of breath from those unused to a duchess who bit back. But the real blow came during the dancing. A member of Parliament, a hawkish man named Lord Radcliffe, loudly remarked, near the orchestra, "It is remarkable that Ravensworth aligns himself with the daughter of a man who tried to sabotage the Crown's interests overseas. Perhaps he's developed unconventional tastes." The words were meant to humiliate her. But before Amara could speak, Alexander stepped forward. His voice, smooth and commanding, carried across the ballroom. If integrity and courage are unconventional tastes, then I am guilty as charged, and I would rather stand beside a woman of honor than a hall full of cowards. Gasps spread like wildfire. Whispers exploded. Then, with calculated grace, he took her hand and raised it to his lips, kissing it slowly, deliberately, in front of the entire room. His gaze locked with hers, not just for the audience, but for her. The Duchess of Ravensworth, he declared, is not defined by your lies. She is defined by the strength you could never hope to possess. The music faltered, then stopped. For a heartbeat, the ballroom hung in stunned silence. Then came the shift. Noblemen cleared their throats. Ladies adjusted their stances. The power of the moment rippled outward. In a single act, Alexander had drawn a line in the sand publicly, irrevocably. Later, outside on the terrace, under lantern light and summer stars, Amara exhaled deeply. You didn't have to do that. Yes, he said quietly. I did. She looked at him, really looked at him, not as the cold duke she had married, but as the man who had just burned his political safety for her dignity. Alexander, she whispered, you may have just started a war. His gaze softened. Then we'll fight it together. For the first time, she reached for his hand, not out of obligation, but out of something dangerously close to trust. The night of the summer gala had changed everything. London's gossiping elite could no longer pretend their whispers were harmless. They had witnessed a duke choose his duchess before them all, not out of political necessity, but out of unwavering loyalty. In the days that followed, the air within Ravensworth Manor shifted in ways neither Alexander nor Amara could fully articulate. The servants were lighter on their feet. Conversations lingered longer, and somewhere between the silence of the corridors and the blooming roses in the conservatory, two guarded souls began to thaw. Amara spent her mornings walking through the gardens, a habit that had begun as a way to claim space, but had turned into a quiet ritual. On one of these mornings, as the sun burned away the mist, she found Alexander waiting at the end of the rose walk. No cane today, no gloves. Just him, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze steady but different, softer. Good morning, Your Grace, she said with careful lightness. Alexander, he corrected quietly. She blinked. Pardon? When we are alone, he said, stepping closer. I'd prefer you use my name. The simple request landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples. Gentle. Unexpected. She inclined her head, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. Good morning, Alexander. They began to walk together not as a duke and duchess locked in strategic silence, but as two people unraveling each other's histories, one thread at a time. She spoke of her youth, of how she spoke of her youth, of how she'd learned to build a fortress of wit and composure. He spoke of his father, a man of brutal expectations, who believed love weakened a legacy. He said a duke must be respected, never loved, Alexander murmured. He raised me to see affection as a vulnerability that powerful men couldn't afford. And you believed him? She asked gently. For a long time, he admitted. Until you. She stopped walking. Me? His gaze found hers, unwavering. You walk into rooms as if their judgment doesn't exist. You challenge me without fear. You've turned a house of silence into something alive. I didn't think that was possible. That evening, a summer storm swept through the countryside, violent, beautiful, cleansing. Amara stood by the open windows of her private salon, watching lightning illuminate the sky. She didn't hear him approach until his reflection appeared in the glass beside hers. You always watch storms? He asked. They remind me that power can be loud and beautiful, she replied. Not everything strong has to be cold. For a long moment, they simply stood together, rain pattering against the panes. Then, he spoke, low and hesitant, as if testing the ground before him. Amara, when I married you, I saw you as a solution, a shield, an answer to Parliament and society. He paused. But somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as a strategy. She turned to face him fully. The firelight flickered against his face, revealing a man stripped of his usual composure. He continued, voice rougher now. You've undone me, piece by piece. I don't know when it happened. Perhaps when you challenged me in the conservatory, or when you stood in that storm and refused to bend. Or maybe, he exhaled, it was when I saw you walk into that ballroom, surrounded by wolves, and never flinch. Her heart clenched, not with girlish giddiness but with the ache of someone who never thought such words would be meant for her again. Alexander, she whispered. He stepped closer. I cannot keep pretending that this is just convenience. You have taken root here. He touched his chest lightly in places I thought were barren. For the first time, he reached for her not as a duke claiming what is his, but as a man asking permission. His fingers brushed hers gently, uncertainly. She didn't pull away. I've lived 40 years hearing that love belongs to the young, she said softly. That desire fades, that passion dies, that women like me should be grateful for scraps. But when I look at you, Alexander, I don't feel forgotten. I feel seen. And then, finally, he kissed her. It was not the kiss of courtship or performance. It was a confession, a surrender, a bridge built between two people who had both spent their lives behind walls. His hand cupped her jaw, her fingers curled into his coat. The rain crashed outside, but inside the world stilled. When they broke apart, their foreheads remained pressed together, their breaths mingling. Amara, he whispered, voice unsteady. I love you. The words, once unthinkable to a man like him, now came like a vow. She smiled through a soft, trembling laugh. Say it again, I love you. This time, she didn't need to hear it twice. She already knew. That night, for the first time since their marriage, they dined not at opposite ends of the long table, but side by side, and as candles burned low, laughter filled Ravensworth Manor, a sound the house had not heard in years. The fortress had fallen, and in its place, something extraordinary was being built. Summer settled over London like a soft gold veil. Invitations flooded into Ravensworth Manor not because society had suddenly become kind, but because power had shifted. The once unattainable duke and the unmarried spinster had become the couple no one could stop talking about. Their marriage had begun as a curiosity. It became a scandal, and now it was a force. The true test, however, arrived with the parliamentary summer banquet, an annual gathering where the nation's most influential men and women gathered beneath glittering chandeliers to display alliances and test strength with elegant cruelty. Amara had attended such events for decades, always as an observer, a tolerated guest, a witty wallflower. But this year was different. She would walk in as Duchess of Ravensworth, with Alexander at her side, and for the first time, society would have to face her as an equal. The evening arrived warm and clear. Ravensworth's carriage rolled through the streets of London, lanterns glowing along the way. Inside, Amara sat across from Alexander, dressed in white silk embroidered with gold. The gown shimmered with every movement, regal but commanding. Around her neck, she wore a single strand of pearls, the same ones she had worn at the spring gala, the night his gaze had first found hers. "You're quiet," Alexander said, watching her closely. "Remembering," she replied. "A year ago, I attended this banquet alone. I stood in corners, smiling at people who didn't care to see me. Tonight, I intend to make them look." His mouth curved in that rare, private smile that only she had earned. "They won't be able to look away." The parliamentary hall was ablaze with light, its marble floors polished to mirrors. Music floated from the string quartet, and the air buzzed with murmurs. As the herald announced their arrival, their graces, the Duke and Duchess of Ravensworth, a hush swept the room. Amara stepped onto the marble floor with her chin high and her hand resting on Alexander's arm. Every inch of her radiated poise, strength, and the quiet defiance of a woman who had endured society's cruelty and remained unbroken. The same matrons who once whispered about her age now stared in open astonishment. Younger women, once dismissive, looked at her with a mix of curiosity and awe. Men who had overlooked her now scrambled to recall her name. They were greeted first by Lord Radcliffe, the man who had nearly humiliated her weeks before. "Your Graces," he said smoothly, "how delightful to see you both. I trust London has treated you kindly since the gala." Alexander's voice was calm but edged with steel. "London has learned to mind its tongue." Radcliffe chuckled, but the tremor in his smile betrayed him. Then came Lord Pembroke, the worst of the whisperers. "I must say, Duchess, you are quite the revelation." Who would have thought? Amara stopped him with a gentle, measured smile. That a woman could become more dangerous at 40 than she ever was at 20. Yes, it surprises them all. A ripple of laughter spread through nearby guests, not cruel, but delighted. The tide was turning. As the evening progressed, Alexander moved through the crowd with her, not in front of her. For every political conversation, every strategic introduction, he deferred to her insight, her sharp tongue, her calm command. When a noblewoman tried to dismiss Amara's comment about trade policy with a condescending pat on the hand, Alexander interrupted smoothly. "My wife has a keener understanding of Parliament's hypocrisies than half the men in this room." The noblewoman flushed scarlet. Amara only smiled. The highlight of the night came when the musicians struck up a waltz. A hush fell as Alexander extended his hand to her, not out of obligation, but with a softness that everyone could see. "May I have this dance?" he asked. "You may, Your Grace," she teased, though her eyes glistened. They stepped into the center of the floor, and as they danced, whispers turned into stares, stares into admiration. This was no youthful debutante fluttering under his gaze. This was a woman fully grown, fully aware of her worth, being loved by the most powerful man in the room. Their movements were fluid, deliberate, two people who had found each other not despite their age, but because of it. By the end of the evening, the narrative had shifted. She carries herself like a queen. He looks at her differently, like she's the only one in the room. Perhaps love doesn't belong only to the young. And when they departed the banquet, it was to the sound of applause. Not mockery, not gossip, respect. Back at Ravensworth, under a sky thick with summer stars, they walked slowly through the rose gardens that had once been overrun with weeds. The air was warm, fragrant, alive. "I never thought," Amara said softly, "that after 40, life could begin again." Alexander took her hands in his. "It didn't begin again," he said. "It began when I met you." Her breath caught as he leaned in and kissed her, not with hunger, but with deep, unshakable love, the kind forged not in fleeting passion, but in shared battles and quiet triumphs. That night, as lanterns flickered against stone walls, the Duke and Duchess of Ravensworth stood not as a scandal, but as a legend, a love story that defied society, age, and expectation. The woman they mocked became the Duchess they could not ignore, and the man they called unattainable finally found the soul he hadn't known he was searching for.